Is it not strange that we can dream about things that don't yet exist? That we can fantasize about worlds that we'll never be able to explore? Somewhere in the long history of our evolution, a perfect set of circumstances aligned at just the right moment to give us the imagination we have today. But how this occurred is still in question. We know imagination is the foundation of creativity. Mental images get created here, sensations are felt there, all of which come together to create something new. Yet despite this, what imagination is, or how it came to be, is still an answer that has been incredibly elusive over the years. And so my goal today is to take you back, way back, to the beginning, through the key stages of progress that led to this extraordinary capability becoming what it is today. Our journey begins roughly 600 to 700 million years ago, with the emergence of what would become known as the precursor to the brain, nerve nets. These primitive structures consist of neurons spread throughout an organism's entire body, almost like a web, and were used to detect changes in the environment, such as differences in light or concentrations of chemicals, all to trigger movement in response. Jellyfish, coral, and sea anemones are examples of creatures that still use this type of basic nervous system. But while nerve nets are useful for simple tasks like withdrawing in response to touch, they leave a lot to be desired, and one of the big reasons for this is the lack of centralization that exists within their nervous system. Even with this being the case, nerve nets laid the foundation for what would eventually become the powerhouse of a brain we have today. Moving ahead slightly, a more efficient means to integrate sensory information was necessary, and during the Cambrian expansion, the solution to this problem was the centralization of the nervous system. Here the brain transitioned from a nerve net to something called a nerve ring. C. elegans is probably the best example of this today, with roughly 1/3 of the entire amount of cells in its body dedicated just to its brain. These creatures had a basic sense of smell and used chemotaxis to detect various chemicals in their environment, which allowed for a better ability to pick up on things happening around them, but more importantly, it allowed for directed movement. In animals with nerve rings, most of the neurons are located in the head of the animal, with 3 predominant types: sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. The sensory neurons form the bulk of the nerve ring, where they then connect to interneurons which send the signal throughout the body. The motor neurons then connect to muscle cells, allowing the animal to move in response to the stimulus picked up by the senses. And it works like this: if the concentration of something beneficial increases, move towards it. If it decreases, then move away from it. Centralizing the nervous system is what allowed for specialization to develop, and specialization is the next milestone towards imagination. In a similar time frame, around 550 million years ago, segmented brains emerged. These brains are just a bunch of ganglia, which is basically just a cluster of nerve cells used to process information and then control for corresponding movement. Each ganglia operates somewhat independently, but all of them are controlled by one central ganglion. This can be done because they're connected through nerve cords, which allows for communication between the different segments. The primary advantage of this is the ability of each ganglion to process local information and generate a local response, which, over time, would allow for each individual ganglion to become better and better at picking up on one specific type of information. In other words, it allows for hyperspecialization. This is probably the starting point for how the 5 senses emerged, but while segmented brains like those of earthworms provide the ability to gather different types of information, complex learning requires the ability to also interpret that information in a meaningful way. And this is how the first version of the cortex evolved. In a recent study by Williams, false water cobras underwent a series of tests to determine whether or not they could learn through reinforcement. The task was simple: train the snakes to follow a blue ball from one cage into another cage. If the snakes performed the desired outcomes correctly, they were rewarded with food. If they didn't, then no food was given. Within 51 sessions, every snake learned to follow the blue ball into the secondary enclosure. This is a great example of positive reinforcement in action. The snakes use their senses to get information and then use that information to get a reward. Many other species, including fish, amphibians, and even some insects, have this ability to learn, an ability that is predicated on a more complex system, specifically the dopaminergic system. But here's why this is so important. Dopamine works through anticipation. It's not obtaining the award that causes a spike in dopamine. Instead, it's the potential for a reward that spikes dopamine. And so the revelation having a reward circuit creates is the ability for us to learn through reinforcement. When an animal does something that causes dopamine signals to increase, it makes the behavior that led to that increase more likely to occur. There's no doubt something like this would have helped animals move through their environment, but where dopamine truly becomes useful is in learning what to avoid. In a study by Falzone in 2002, the dopamine D4 receptor gene was knocked out of mice, which basically means it was rendered inactive. This was done to understand how dopamine affects fear behavior. During the experiment, 2 different groups of mice were placed in a maze, one with the D4 receptor knocked out and one that had normal mice, to compare differences in how they would explore. Those lacking the D4 receptor gene took significantly longer to find their way through the maze, stopping repeatedly whenever a new area they hadn't seen before presented itself. This clearly demonstrated how mice without the active dopamine receptors were more afraid of new environments, which hints towards how dopamine affects avoidance learning. But learning what to avoid or what to pursue is useless without having the ability to recall what you learned, and this is why memory is so important. Memory is also something that the pallium is responsible for. In vertebrates other than mammals, the dorsal cortex interacts with the pallium to encode or retrieve memories learned through reinforcements. In another study by Ledage, this is exemplified perfectly. In this experiment, side-blotched lizards were put through a maze to see if they could learn and then remember the location of an escape hole. If they accomplished this successfully, it would show that even reptiles have memory. The study worked like this. The lizards were placed at the center of a maze where they were then allowed to explore for about 10 minutes. There were many different exits, but only one would lead back to their home enclosure. After learning which hole in the maze would lead back to their home, the maze was rotated 180 degrees, all to test if the lizards could use things like room features to find the hole again. When being trained on where the goal was before the maze got rotated, the lizards took less and less time to find the hole, showing that through reinforcement, they were able to learn. But even after the maze was rotated, the lizards were still able to navigate to the original location of the goal, and did so with significantly less time, using spatial cues from the room to do so, showing in real time that the lizards had used memory to navigate. The dopaminergic system is crucial for both reinforcement learning and memory. In this case, the rewarding experience that leads to an increase in dopamine is returning to their home, a safe, familiar environment. And so when this causes a spike in dopamine, it does 2 things. First, it enhances the synaptic connections associated with the sensory cues, making the animal better at picking up on these cues in the future. Second, the binding of dopamine to its receptors can actually trigger changes in gene expression. These changes result in the synthesis of new proteins that are crucial for long-term memory formation, as they stabilize the synaptic connections that encode this memory. This process is called long-term potentiation, and it works through positive feedback loops. As the process is repeated, the lizards will continue to solidify their memories and make them stronger over time. Learning and memory are 2 of the most important steps in the evolution of imagination. But even with that said, they by themselves are not enough for imagination to develop. And this is for many reasons. Imagination requires abstraction, it requires thought. But most importantly, it requires the ability to synthesize our memories into something new. And this brings us to the next milestone, emotions. The question of what purpose emotions hold is still up for debate. Regardless, one of the leading theories is for a better way of recalling memories. Emotions make things stand out. They make experiences almost immediately recognizable. But most importantly, emotions can overcome the previous limitations of learning. The biggest disadvantage of reinforcement learning is, well, how long it takes. Not only must the creature directly experience something in order to learn, which can be fatal, but it also has to do so repeatedly before the action can eventually be associated with an award. Emotions add a whole new dimension of complexity to this. Emotional tagging makes memories easier to recall. Sudden spikes in emotions allow for selective focus, and both positive and negative emotions can enhance memory without the need for directly experiencing punishments or rewards. This is possible because of something called the amygdala, or in reptiles, a homologue of it. When a potential threat or reward is encountered, sensory inputs quickly alert the amygdala, which then initiates an emotional response. This response involves the release of neurotransmitters, specifically epinephrine and norepinephrine, depending on the emotion. This step is key because it quickly induces a physiological change, making the animal ready for action. But it's also a mechanism used for learning and memory. The amygdala is adept at associating emotions with specific sensory cues. This again enhances the neural connections related to these experiences. But this time, the experience is emotionally tagged and then stored in the medial cortex, making these memories easier to call upon in the future. And when a similar situation is encountered, the animal knows exactly how to respond. The development of emotions in relationship to the evolution of imagination is a key milestone because of the feeling it generates. While quicker response times are one benefit, a more subtle but meaningful advantage is the vividness of these emotionally charged memories. Emotional experiences induce stronger and longer-lasting synaptic changes, with the memories associated not just recalling the outcome of the situation, but also the context, the details, and everything in between, which acts as the bedrock for the next milestone, visualization. Moving forward in time, 230 million years ago, the dinosaurs emerged. But alongside them was another small primitive animal, a mammal. While the landscape was shared, dinosaurs ruled the surface, and so to survive, these mammals had to rely on other means, namely by hiding underground during the day and then emerging at night to hunt. But this required something else, warm blood, or in scientific terms, endothermy, which is the body's ability to maintain a stable internal temperature regardless of how the environment changes. However, this came with a cost. Significantly more food is required to accomplish this, but because of the restrictions mammals had on when they could hunt, they had to develop a new system for memorizing the places where they had previously found food. The result was the development of the neocortex. The neocortex, building off the emotionally charged memories formed by the amygdala, works by recording sensory aspects of a landscape and then linking it to the part of the brain that controls navigation, with the whole system being interconnected by the hippocampus, a memory system that we still use today. But in these mammals, it was the first form of imagination, a simple version of the future, envisioned through mental roadmaps that activate the brain in the same way actual experience does. Multiple studies have shown how rats visualize navigational plans in their mind's eye. First, place cells, a type of neuron, exhibit a high rate of firing when a rat is in a specific location. Each place cell is associated with one area in the animal's environment. So, for example, one place cell might fire when the animal is in the northwest corner of a room, while another might fire when the animal is in the southeast corner. The key is that the firing of the place cells is highly specific, and each cell is only fired in response to one particular location. At any given time, multiple place cells could be firing, the combination of which provides a unique code that marks the rat's current position. As the rat moves from area to area, different place cells will become active and inactive in a coordinated sequence, a pattern that represents the animal's movement through space, a way of tracking its path. But this only works because of another type of neuron, the grid cell. Grid cells fire in patterns that resemble, well, a grid. That's where it gets its name from. The grid covers the entire space the rat can move through, with each grid cell firing at multiple spots that are evenly spaced from each other. The use of these grid cells is to create a system that helps the rats measure distances. Unlike place cells, which are tied to a location, grid cells provide a universal way of understanding space, and are not tied to any location at all. So with the help of the patterns grid cells create, rats can track their position as they move through different areas. This only works because place cells use the grid cell system to pinpoint their specific locations more accurately. In these early mammals, this ability to visualize was likely the only reason why mammals were able to maintain warm-bloodedness and ultimately survive alongside the dinosaurs. But there's another breakthrough here as well. Visualization gives one the ability to simulate the future. Survival often depends on an animal's ability to make split-second decisions. If a predator is chasing me, do I run this way or do I run that way? When two paths diverge, which will take me to food and which one will make me food? This early ability to visualize is what makes all the difference. In a different study of rats navigating a simple M-shaped maze, the place cells of the hippocampus were recorded when the rats reached a decision point. In doing so, it was found that the place cells would turn on and off extremely rapidly at about 8 times per second when the rats reached a decision point, showcasing the animal's current position and the two alternative future paths it could take, which means the hippocampus in these rats helped them make a decision by creating a menu of imagined scenarios, which were then evaluated based on memory, with the final decision being made by factoring in the animal's current needs and emotions, such as whether it was hungry or scared or curious. Taken together, this points towards the hippocampus being responsible not just for recording the past or the present, but also for imagining the future. There is an argument to be made that this process is unconscious, and that's primarily because when the animal pauses, no detailed mental calculations are involved, which is why researchers are still kind of mixed on their stance of whether or not this counts as imagination. But the same cannot be said for the next milestone: dreams. With the rise of mammals, another process had taken hold, one that is probably the most recognizable form of imagination: dreams. These vivid, bizarre, involuntary fantasies occur only during the REM stage of sleep. Because of this, it's been hypothesized that all animals whose rest includes periods of REM sleep must also experience dreams, something that is backed up by the fact that both marsupial and placental mammals have REM sleep, while the egg-laying mammal the echidna does not, suggesting that REM sleep evolved 140 million years ago, which is roughly around the same time dreams are believed to have originated. The function, though, of why dreams evolved is not understood at all. It's a very, very difficult thing to try and research. But even with that said, there is some evidence that points towards dreams being adaptive and not necessarily an accidental outcome at all. For example, in humans, solutions to creative problems can be found during sleep, indicating there is some ability for dreams to combine thoughts or ideas in new ways. Dreams also reactivate memories, and the amygdala, which processes emotions, is also highly active during the REM stage of sleep. But the strongest piece of evidence suggesting that dreams are adaptive is the fact that dreaming of a physical activity activates the same brain regions as actually performing that activity, which means mental imagery serves as a form of practice for the brain. If this is true, then imagining an activity and actually doing it are not as different as we think it is. It's also something that would be extremely useful, as exercising parts of the brain without physically experiencing the stimulus, especially if it's dangerous, can better prepare us for those real-life situations. Think about the last time you had a nightmare. Nightmares lead to accelerated heart rates, sweating, and lingering effects of anxiety, even well after waking up. A clear indicator of how powerful dreams can be in triggering physiological changes. So despite dreams being simulated images, they feel real. Extremely real. And if imagining an event can stimulate the same brain regions as actually experiencing that event, then the more realistic the dream is, the more the brain treats this information as genuine, which would prepare us to face real challenges, potentially impacting survival and reproductive success. This is the threat simulation hypothesis, and it proposes that dreams evolved for this very reason. But this video is not on the evolution of dreams. This video is about the evolution of imagination. And so the question would be, how do dreams provide a stepping stone towards the development of imagination? Well, the answer lies in the default mode network, a feature most clearly observed in the primate brain. During REM sleep, the brain is highly active in consolidating memories, weaving together fragments of past experiences, emotions, and knowledge, all to create new narratives. This process not only strengthens memories, but more importantly, builds up the brain's ability to make new connections, the key component of imagination. Dreaming is also emotionally charged, and studies have shown that it is linked to helping process emotions. For example, in a study by Malinowski, it was found that dreams often reflect emotional concerns. Taken a step further, a study by Sarah Mednick's Sleep and Cognition Lab found that people who recalled dreaming showed better retention of negative emotional memories, and more importantly, a reduced reactivity to them the next day. Call it the ability to think outside the box, or call it the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Regardless, the ability to generate new perspectives with the same amount of information is vital in imagination, something that dreams do have the ability to do. Finally, the most telling piece of evidence has to do with the evolution of the default mode network itself. This brain network is crucial for reflecting, planning, and simulating future scenarios. Its evolution paralleled the development of dreaming and emerged in a similar time frame. On top of that, the default mode network provides the support structure for imagination. We know this because the default mode network works together with the primary region of the brain responsible for imagination. And so it could be the case that the continuous use of this brain structure during sleep gradually enhanced its ability, allowing it to eventually be carried over into wakeful tasks, such as strategizing and eventually abstract thought. Dreaming is the virtual reality generator that impacted the evolution of imagination. But there's still one more piece to this puzzle: prefrontal synthesis. Prefrontal synthesis is the highest form of creativity. It is the ability to combine different elements stored in memory to create something new. In other words, it is imagination, and is evident in everything from language to tool use. But the most important definition for us is conscious synthesis. It is completely unique compared to, say, dreaming or the previous forms of visualization in the fact that it is purposeful. And because of this, it requires a new brain region, specifically the lateral prefrontal cortex, which works by synchronizing two or more groups of neurons that each represent different objects by adjusting them to fire in sync, something that we then experience as one unified object. It's speculated that the lateral prefrontal cortex is what separates humans from primates and even other hominids like Neanderthals. Either way, what we do know is that it evolved roughly 70,000 years ago, and we know this because of archaeological evidence. Figurative art and tools made out of bone all emerged during this time. But there's a big problem in trying to map out the timeline of prefrontal synthesis, an inherent contradiction. This conscious blending requires a specific type of language in order to develop. But this language also requires prefrontal synthesis. So it's a classic chicken and egg scenario with no clear distinction on which one came first. The language that I'm talking about is called recursive language. It is the ability to create an infinite amount of unique sentences by putting one sentence inside another sentence, which can be done indefinitely in human language. And this is actually what separates our language from that of other animals. But just to illustrate how intertwined these two things are, a well-known study by Romeo found that children who have fewer interactive conversations develop weaker variations of the neural connections needed for prefrontal synthesis. And those without any recursive conversations at all lack the ability for prefrontal synthesis altogether, which means being a genetically modern human isn't enough to acquire prefrontal synthesis. We need early exposure to recursive language. But see, here's the thing. What this suggests, at least to me, is that language is not fully responsible for the evolution of imagination. And I say this because modern language evolved 600,000 years ago. It just wasn't recursive. And this wasn't because of some lack of vocal ability either. It was because of a lack of imagination. Language has always been constrained by our ability to think outside the box. No animal can follow a command to retrieve a long red straw among other objects. This isn't because they can't learn the words. It's because they can't purposefully imagine an object with that shape or color. Prefrontal synthesis is the pinnacle of human imagination, and it's completely absent from the archaeological records before 70,000 years ago. But then suddenly, after this time frame, it becomes abundant. And so, somewhere along this journey, there was a 500,000-year gap between the emergence of language and the explosion of imagination. Part of this is cultural, as again, recursive conversations are needed to develop the brain regions of creativity. But there's a genetic component here as well. Modern children who are not exposed to recursive language before the age of 5 cannot acquire prefrontal synthesis later in life, even after years of therapy. This means there is a critical window in childhood when prefrontal synthesis must be acquired. The theory of how this could have evolved, even with all these restrictions, is by way of something called the Romulus and Remus hypothesis. It suggests a mutation that led to a prefrontal cortex delay was acquired by a group of children. These children then spent more time conversing with each other, which ultimately resulted in the invention of recursive language. Since they were then able to communicate recursively at this pivotal time in development, the unique human ability for imagination emerged. Something that is obviously advantageous and would have spread into the gene pool over time. As speculative as this theory is, there is some evidence to back it up. For starters, Neanderthals, while possessing language, aren't believed to have had recursive communication systems. They did have some ability for art, but it didn't require conscious synthesis. It was more things like using specific dyes for hand paintings. not creating structures that don't exist. Their tool-making abilities were also somewhat limited compared to humans. They didn't build elaborate traps or hunt with complicated schemes. They just tracked something and then tried to stab it as much as possible. So whether or not this theory holds ground is obviously something that still needs to be tested. But what we do know, either way, is that imagination is a biological function. It has both a structure and a purpose. It uses emotion, learning, memory, dreams, and the ability to blend things together, all to create something new. When we as humans investigate an unfamiliar topic, we fantasize about it constantly, using imagination to get a grip on subjects we just don't yet understand. Science fiction is a great example of this. And to be honest with you, if we didn't have imagination, I don't think there's any shot we would be as successful of a species as we are today. Recently, the debate around what makes something conscious has exploded in popularity. A large reason for this is the development in AI. But while intelligence and its relationship to consciousness is what's primarily discussed, I don't think imagination should be left out of the equation. Sure, being awake or aware of one's environment is completely different to visualizing things that don't yet exist. And maybe intelligence is the precursor that would inevitably lead to something like prefrontal synthesis. But there's no doubt about it. What makes humans special, from a conscious standpoint, from an intelligence standpoint, or frankly from any other standpoint, is our ability to create things that are new. Just ask the Neanderthals, who, despite having a similar level of intelligence, no longer exist today. And that's one element I think is required for AI to ever truly become conscious: imagination, which is what the next and final video in this playlist is going to be about. Until next time, cheers.